Seminarau ar-lein Adran y Gymraeg ag Astudiaethau Celtaidd. Will Parker, The Wandering Pig and the Topographic Itinerary, a Cambro-Gaelic cultural ecotype, the 10th of May, 2022.
Okay, wel, noswaith dda i chi. A croeso i seminar ola yn y gyfres yma. Wedi i cynnal. Muted. Oh, hold on, dwi wedi mutio. Helo, ydych chi'n gallu clywed fi nawr?
Ydyn ni'n clywed ti? Ie, dechrau eto, Simon.
Oce, na ni, reit, noswaith dda pawb, a chroeso i seminar ola gyfres yma gan Adran y Gymraeg ag Astudiaethau Celtaidd Brifysgol Aberystwyth. Heno, ein siaradwr gwadd yw Will Parker. Welcome to you all to the last in our series of research seminars this semester here at the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth University. And our final speaker is Will Parker, who is a PhD student here in the department. He studied Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic at Cambridge between 1991 and 1994, and then worked in the IT sector for 10 years before taking a break and publishing a translation and commentary on the 4 branches of the Mabinogi. After that, he worked as a teacher in the further education sector for another 10 years and then began his PhD here in Aberystwyth University, looking at a number of early medieval insular texts which have to do with King Arthur. And tonight he is going to talk to us about The Wandering Pig and the Topographic Itinerary, a Cambro-Gaelic cultural ecotype. Welcome, Will.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, Aberystwyth University. The presentation I'm about to give obviously relates primarily to the culture and landscape of medieval Wales and Ireland, but I hope that no one will mind if I begin with a rather whimsically romantic view of the contemporary English countryside. The metaphor of a 4-dimensional landscape, in fact, has its uses. It offers a way into a recognizable mode of being in the world, in which the events of the past and the landscape of the present converge in a single frame of reference. The projection of cultural memory onto local topography is, of course, not unique to England and can be observed in a wide range of historical and ethnographic contexts, some of which will be discussed in this paper. An augmented reality of precisely this kind is projected by a particular narrative sequence from the literature of medieval Wales, in which an account of the hunting of a giant boar assumes the character of a detailed topographic itinerary. The consistent association of porcine and topographic themes appears to be specific to the medieval insular world, although a number of international comparanda might be identified in relation to the constituent aspects of this complex. In this paper, I'll be exploring these generic categories and interrogating their possible cultural historic significance before arriving at a qualified conclusion regarding the background and context of the medieval Welsh episode. The passage itself occurs in the prose tell conventionally known as Cilwch ag Olwen, hereafter Cilwch, witnessed in full in the Red Book of Hergest and partially in the White Book of Rhydderch. Sometimes known as the oldest Arthurian tale, Cilwch narrates an episodic series of anoithai, wondrous feats based on the legends and anecdotes associated with the famous warlord. The relevant passage represents the longest and arguably most dramatic of these episodes, constituting a semi-autonomous narrative in its own right. Within the context of Cilwch as a whole, this episode serves as a kind of climactic action sequence of a sort that typifies the final stages of the dramatic arc. Yet there are other aspects of this narrative, most notably its obsessive interest in topographic detail, which would, to the modern reader at least, seem to detract from this dramatic momentum, betraying the first of many suggestions of an awkward yet somehow indispensable functional agenda inherited from an earlier source. The allusion to what appears to be an earlier version of this narrative among the mirabilia of the 9th century Historia Brittonum confirms its independent existence prior to its integration into Cilwch. Neither of these variants appear to derive directly from the other, and we might therefore assume the presence of an ambient oral narrative tradition on which both sources drew, current in South Wales across at least 3 centuries of the early Middle Ages. The basic theme involved the hunting of a boar named Turk Troith or Turk Troid by a hero or warlord named Arthur. Although the precise route of the hunt may have varied from one version to another, the places through which it passed were real and recognisable and would have intersected significantly with the everyday geography of its audience communities. Footprints and other impressions made by the animal and his pursuers were noted and described, with the implication that these traces were still surviving as visible landmarks. Beyond this, there may have been considerable variation. In the version we find in Historia Brittonum, Arthur is described as Miles, a soldier, but there's nothing to suggest that he was accompanied by anyone other than his dog. In the Cilwch version, the hunter was a warlord with an extensive retinue, and the hunt itself undertook the aspect of a military campaign. The traditio to which these various texts allude will be referred to in general terms as the hunting of the Turk, while acknowledging that there would have been various iterations and a complex, perhaps largely unreconstructible, evolutionary development throughout this oral background. While there can be little certainty as to the precise content of the pre-existing oral source, as opposed to any extraneous content added or embellished by its 12th century author, the episode as we find it in Cilwch might be summarised thus. Arthur's warband goes to Ireland, where the Turk Troith has ravaged a third of the island. The Turk and his brood are then chased back over the Irish Sea, followed by Arthur and his men. The Turk lands at Porthclais. Arthur's warband land at nearby St David's. The Turk and his Borlits rampage around the Daigleddiv area before being chased by Arthur and his men up into the Prestelles. Here the Boers are chased up Glyn Niver before the Turk stands his ground, killing 4 of Arthur's men at Cwm Cerwyn. The Boers are then pursued down to Poeliniog, where further fighting takes place, before the chase is continued down to Abertwy. The trail is then lost at Glyn Ystyn. While searching for the Boers, Arthur's men are ambushed near Dyffryn Llwcher, and after heavy fighting, the Turk veers up north up the Amman Valley. The 3 remaining Boers are then chased into the uplands of southwestern Brecon Beacons. The Turk stands his ground at Llwchewin, inflicting further casualties before being hounded onwards to Llwchtawi. The Boers then separate, with the eldest of the Turk's brood, Gregin Gwallt Eraint, veering northwards towards Ceredigion. Llwydog Gofiniad peels downwards towards Ystrad Eel and the Tawgirth area. The Turk, for his part, disappears somewhere around the Brecon Beacons area. Arthur gathers all his men to ambush the Turk at the mouth of the River Severn, vowing to defend Cornwall from the rampaging Boer. One of Arthur's patrols intercepts the Turk at Ewais, driving him into the Severn. The Boer is then pursued through part of the West Country before being driven back into the Bristol Channel, where he eventually disappears off into the ocean, never to be seen again. This episode was subject to an inspired critical analysis by Gwyn Jones, in which parallels were drawn between this dramatised boar hunt and other notable examples of what we might call the hunting epic, a well-established topos in the Western literary canon, extending from Ovid's Caledonian Boar to Melville's Moby Dick. This topos is predicated on the metaphorical identification between hunting and warfare, a conceit found within almost all Western aristocratic societies. Such a metaphor encourages the elevation of the quarry into an adversary of comparable status to the hero. And, as Jones has shown, the common aspect of these hunting epics is the endowment of the hunted animal with both gigantic size and a malign, human-like intelligence.
Yeah.
A closer contextualized analysis of the hunting of the Turk sequence reveals certain other characteristics that are rather less typical of the hunting epic as it appears more widely in Western literature. The intense topographic interest, while not unique to the insular world, was a characteristic organizing principle in the traditional learned cultures of Ireland and Wales. Furthermore, pigs and pig hunting had a particular significance in these insular narrative systems, which further informs the specific significance of the hunting of the Turk. We will consider each of these aspects in turn, noting their coalescence in a uniquely insular complex of associations I've referred to, for want of a better term, as the topographic pig. The geographic precision of the hunting of the Turk cries out for explanation. When I first looked in detail at the route described by the hunting of the Turk, I was struck by the fact that it seems to connect some of the principal Irish Sea and Bristol Channel maritime networks with the overland routes into England on one hand and North Wales on the other. The value of such a narrative route map is obvious enough, but was this narrative navigational utility an inherent design feature or a spurious coincidence? This question is best answered with reference to other examples of topographic discourse from the medieval insular world, with further reference to comparable examples from other times and places. Topography is, of course, a characteristic preoccupation of traditional societies. The tendency for cultural memory to become cognitively entangled with the ancestral landscape is strongly apparent, for example, among the Western Apache, for whom toponymics are accorded an evidence value comparable to that which textual source material represents to the modern Western historian. Indeed, such is the revelatory power of these traditional place names for the Western Apache that their very intonation is endowed with a sacred significance, being a direct link to the voices and experiences of the ancestors themselves. Similarly, for the Buryat of the Lake Baikal region, the prominent sacred places are often associated with the common ancestors of clan groups that surround them. Geography and genealogy are thus brought within a common frame of reference. Perhaps the most characteristic example of topographic discourse from the medieval insular world would be the so-called Dinshankas, lore of places. We find clusters of these topographic notices throughout the Book of Leinster and in later manuscripts. Isidore's Etymologica had given the scholars of early Christian Ireland a new set of tools with which to engage with their native tradition, and the Dinshankas tracts are a characteristic product of this scholastic antiquarian synthesis. As is the case among the present-day Western Apache, the etymological excursions inspired by local onomastics often gave rise to vividly imaginative narrative sequences situated within the inherited frameworks of medieval Irish historiography and genealogy. Morgan Davis has suggested that in the case of Recension C, arguably the oldest stratum of the written Dinshankas tradition, the collection as a whole has been structured geographically, following a path that proceeds from Tara, tracing a traditional circuit of Ireland, and in doing so, taking a route that is culturally endorsed and even culturally determined, and therefore mnemonically apt. It'll be noted, however, that navigation was not the primary aim of this arrangement, but rather the spatially structured memorialization of traditional knowledge. Davis refers to the classical methodology of locational memory, which was bequeathed to medieval scholasticism, almost certainly via the monasteries of the early Christian world. A similar model of landscape as a storehouse and index of traditional narrative is also apparent in the Middle Irish Acalav na Seminarau. As the clerical protagonist St. Patrick passes through the landscape of Ireland, he's given a running commentary by Celtaidd and Oisin, erstwhile companions of the legendary Finn MacCool, narrating a series of anecdotes associated with the places through which they pass. In this way, Patrick's journey provides the organizing principle for an atlas of topographic lore, with a particular emphasis on the Fenian cycle, which, as Anne Dooley notes, was growing in popularity during the 12th century when this text was compiled. Topography tends to feature prominently in the hagiographic literature more generally, a corpus that includes some of the earliest original writing from medieval Ireland and Wales. As is well recognised, such hagiographies, as with secular dynastic origin legends, can be read as quasi-legal statements of geopolitical entitlement. This territorial interest was characteristically underscored through the peripatetic movement of the saint himself, a prominent feature of almost all insular hagiographies. It's through the saint's wandering that his various foundations are said to have been established. So the journey itself represents, in quite a literal way, both a history of the rhizomic growth of the saint's parochia and a set of nodal points around the territorial circuit in question. Saints' cults did not exist in a vacuum in the insular world, or indeed anywhere else, but rather tended to spread through existing communicational arteries, such as maritime trade routes or the Roman road system. In less urbanized contexts, such as early Christian Ireland, they were typically mediated through particular kin-based or ethnic social networks. In Ireland, for example, the cult of Brigith seems to have initially spread through the scattered networks of Fothart communities, a culturally distinct group who occupied various enclaves throughout Southeast Ireland. A similar pattern is possibly evident for the Cambro-Gaelic saints of South Wales, including Brechin, Aidan and Brunach, whose cult centres coincided with the clusters of Ogham inscription in the Pembrokeshire region and the Usk Valley. Sometimes hagiography illuminates these networks with particular clarity, as would seem to have been the case in the conception legend for St. Brechin himself. This describes the journey of Brechin's British mother Marchel on her way to the kingdom of her husband-to-be, the Irish Anlag. The expedition begins at Llanfaes in the Usk Valley heartlands. From here, Marchel is described as travelling to Glen Sevin at the western edge of the Brecon Beacons. After another day travelling westwards through what is now Carmarthenshire, her next stop was at Maedrim. The third day's journey brought Marchel to Porthmawr near St David's, the main access point to the Irish Sea nexus. The geography of Marchel's journey can be explained in a number of ways, most obviously with reference to the old Roman road system. It may also be relevant that the journey connects two main clusters of Ogham inscription in South Wales. The cult centres associated with Brechin and his family, also shown in Bowen's map in the inset, would have been associated with the Cambro-Gaelic Federate communities, a distinct presence in the region during the immediate post-Roman period. But as with a number of the older local saints cults of the Pembrokeshire region, Aidan, Ishmael, Kenai, etc., these would soon become absorbed into the parochia of St David, which seems to have attracted notable support from the Cambro-Gaelic communities and their descendants. It's notable that all the staging posts named on Marchel's journey were either at or near major Davidian centres. As we'll see, a similar ethno-sectarian geography emerges from an analysis of the hunting of the Turk. The signal feature of the hunting of the Turk is, of course, the monstrous giant boar himself, whose destructive rampaging was believed to have left an enduring trace on the toponymy and physical landscape of South Wales. Another crucial detail, less obviously emphasised but nonetheless present in the Killick narrative, was the anthropomorphic character of the Turk and his offspring. Both of these details situate the hunting of the Turk within a distinctive insular genre that we might refer to as the topographic pig hunt, further examples of which we'll consider in due course. But first we need to look at the broader category, the zoomorphic landscape legend, for which we can find examples both within and beyond the insular context. A well-known Welsh example can be found in the group of stories involving a team of oxen known as Uchen Banog. This bovine pair make a notable appearance in Killick itself among the list of Itinerary, where they are described as Nunio and Pebio, whom God transformed into oxen because of their sins. A similar formulation is used for the Turk Troith himself in the same text. Nunio and Pebio seem to have been regarded as concrete historical personalities. They're named in the Jesus 20 genealogies as sons of Erb, a legendary, semi-legendary king of Erging, whose floret Wendy Davis places around AD 550. Pebio himself appears in the hagiographies of both Dyfrig and David as the grateful beneficiary of the saint's healing powers. John Carey has listed a number of topographic tales featuring the Uchen Banog that are relayed in early modern or Victorian sources. The topos seems to have enjoyed a widespread currency in Wales well into the Middle Ages and beyond, and was by no means limited to the southeastern districts associated with the historical Pebio and Nunio themselves. A number of these accounts involve the oxen dragging a creature, sometimes the monstrous Avank, from a church to a lake, or vice versa. As in so many of these zoomorphic landscape legends, the intervening countryside remains marked by observable traces of this journey, hoof marks, furrows, etc. Stories of this kind have been found near Betws-y-Coed, Aberdyfi, and intriguingly, Llanddewi Brefi, where once again we find an explicit connection with the cult of St. David. The origins of this narrative complex remain somewhat unclear, and we're perhaps best off situating the Uchen Banog within a broader generic class that would include the ox that drives St. Aidan around southwest Wales on behalf of St. David, as well as the bull, which marks and gives its name the site of an ecclesiastical house founded by St. Gwynllew near Newport in Gwent. The two feuding bulls at the heart of the Tyne-Byrcania complex, whose violent clashes leave traces in the landscape and toponymics at the end of the great cattle raiding saga, would be stronger, if more remote, representatives of the type. There are some interesting parallels to be drawn with these insular zoomorphic landscape legends and certain narrative forms that occur in the literature of ethnography. A striking example would be the dreaming tracks or songlines of native Australia, popularised by the British travel writer Bruce Chatwin, but previously discussed by anthropologists, including Robert Tonkinson and Theodore Strelo. Dreaming tracks might be briefly defined as routeways that in native Australian thought are understood to have been created by ancestral beings during the formative mythical era that's referred to as the dreaming or the dream time. As Paul Faustish explains, these tracks, which are often several hundred kilometres long, consist of a series of sacred sites defined by mythological events and told in the form of a continuous story. The protagonists in these dreaming narratives are understood to be ancestors of present-day native Australians, and perhaps with reference to the animal names, which often denote native Australian clans and moieties. These ancestors typically have a zoomorphic aspect. The example given by Faustish from the Walpiri people narrates the journey of the kangaroo ancestors, as well as leaving as well as leaving various impressions on the landscape and its toponymy as they progress through Australia's Northern Territory. They overcome various dangers and establish new cultural practices. Not only do stories of this kind celebrate the actions of the sacred ancestors themselves, but they also relate these to the physical and social geography of the present day. Furthermore, they encode survival strategies and practical information about the landscape itself, the whereabouts of safe camping places, water holes, food sources, and dangerous wildlife. Knowledge of this kind would have been indispensable in a pre-cartographic hunter-forager economy, and it's on this basis that we might assume that narratives of this kind were perpetuated through the generations. A further parallel might be noted with the transformer tales of native North America. In one group of such tales, a culture hero known among the Algonquin Indians by variants of the name Gluskap, Gluskabe, Gluskoba, etc., was believed to have made permanent alterations to the landscape and ecology of the region, from taming the wind to the creation of various aquatic species. The zoomorphic raven of the Alaskan Tlingit tradition plays a similar role. Sometimes, as in the Coacal story cycle told by the Thompson River Indians in British Columbia, the transformers are multiple, in this case a group of 3 brothers. In all cases, the activities of these transformer figures leave visible traces on the landscape and toponymy of the region. In some cases, these landmarks arrange themselves in an extended series that's reminiscent both of the dreaming tracks of native Australia and the itinerary of the hunting of the Turk. Given that the ancestors of the inhabitants of medieval Wales, Native America, Native Australia are unlikely to have been in contact much later than the Mesolithic period, the existence of these resemblances raises some staggering implications about the age and durability of this narrative form. It may be that these geo-narrative structures developed independently in their particular contexts, encouraged perhaps by their inherent usefulness as pedagogic tools. Michel Sugiyama has suggested that the transformer legends are a characteristic product of hunter-forager societies, observing that the survival needs of these communities make it essential to impart in-depth knowledge of the surrounding environment to infants before they reach the age of maturity. We might compare the parallel development of these cultural forms with the evolution of certain morphological features, such as flippers or dorsal fins, in animal species of quite different taxonomic classes as a result of common environmental conditions. According to this model, the survival of the zoomorphic landscape legend in the medieval insular world might be seen as an archaic vestige, as it were, from this stage of cultural development, rather as certain morphological and behavioral features of human beings, bipedalism, for instance, or skin without body hair, have been identified by some anthropologists and natural historians as evidence of an evolutionary phase in a semi-aquatic environment. Aspects of the transformer complex can perhaps be found in the famously widespread tail type, known as the magical flight, AT313, which often overlaps with another widespread form that the anthropologist Robert Lowy has described as the son-in-law tasks. Both tend to culminate in a chase sequence in which the hero and heroine escape from the ogreish father by changing themselves into birds or other animals and throwing down magical objects that transform the landscape, e.g. a comb that becomes a forest, a drop that becomes a river, and so forth. As in Killich, this magical flight often occurs after a series of seemingly impossible tasks has been accomplished, corresponding with the final battle or chase sequence, beloved by traditional storytellers and modern filmmakers alike. In terms of its place within the wider narrative architecture of Killich as a whole, the hunting of the Turk could be reasonably explained in this way. However, to account for its presence as a standalone traditio, we need to consider the specific and idiosyncratic field of associations that surround the pig and its feral cousin, the wild boar, in medieval insular culture. One of the more obvious expressions of this complex can be found in the insular motif of the wandering pig. This device is particularly well represented in the hagiographic literature, where it is frequently deployed as part of a formulaic sequence to explain the origin and location of certain monastic foundations. The wild boar or sow leads the saint to a place in the wilderness where he establishes a cell or hermitage that subsequently develops into a significant ecclesiastical centre. This motif appears in the 9th century Breton hagiography of Paul Aurelianus, as well as the 12th century vitae of Dyfrig, Kentigern, Brynach and Cadog. From Ireland, I found instances of the wandering pig motif in the hagiographies of Ciaran of Sayre, Ruadan, Finan and Mulvar. No doubt other examples could be found. The episode involving Cadog is particularly worth looking at rather more closely, emphasizing as it does some of the key motifs. We might note that the boar seems to consciously guide the saint to the key location, looking back over its shoulder as if to mark the spot. There's not just one, but a series of 3 of these spots, each of which the holy man marks by planting a twig in the soil. Furthermore, we might note the perpendicular symmetry of the white swan rising upwards as the boar proceeds outwards on the horizontal plane. A similar configuration, juxtaposing the pig at ground level with a bird at the top of a tree, is recreated in a variant of this episode later on in the same text, and again in the famous Oak Between Two Lakes towards the end of the 4th branch of the Mabinogi. Here, it seems to me, we find the key to the topographical associations of the pig in traditional insular thought. Helpful animals of various sorts feature in these insular hagiographies: stags, wolves, songbirds, etc. But the pig retains a special place as a pathfinder and a path maker, an association which is also evidenced in more secular genres of insular storytelling. The various foundation legends of Cashel, the earliest of which date back to the 8th or 9th centuries, would perhaps be one of the oldest examples extant. It'll be noted that it's 2 visionary swineherds rather than their pigs that act as wayfinders in this story, but it would appear to be a reflex of the same complex of ideas. This group of stories was clearly concerned with the legitimization of the Ioganach hegemony, but there was also a desire to establish a privileged position for the particular client community from which the visionary swineherd emerged. In one version, this was the Muskrach people. In another, it was the Aili, suggesting that this privilege and its legendary basis may have still been in contention as this tradition was initially textualized. As well as the wandering pig motif, there is also a distinct tail type that might be considered symptomatic of this complex of porcine associations. A particularly significant example is the account of the pigs of Drevriu, alluded to at various points in the Dinshankas tradition, and associated with the Roscommon area of northwest central Ireland. It's one of a number of topographic pig stories in which the pig is hunted rather than simply being followed. Furthermore, we find the pig as transformed human motif occurring as a signal feature of this group of stories. The protagonists of this legend are a group of 3 men and their wives, described as fosterlings of Drevriu, herself the mistress of the mythical Angus MacOg and sister of the famous Medva of the Ulster cycle. For reasons that are not made entirely clear, the mother of the male members of this group grows resentful towards these couples and transforms them into swine. Angus does his best to shelter these unfortunate human porcines, placing them in the Leinster home of Buched, the Hospitaller. However, Buched's wife develops a carnivorous desire for one of these transformed fosterlings. Buched himself adopts a curiously protective attitude towards the coveted pig and even offers to kill his own wife on its behalf. The pigs go into hiding, still under the protection of Angus, who advises them to lie low and in 1 year's time perform a ritual action in the oak woods of Tagva. The story culminates in a chase across the northern central plain of Ireland, with the pigs hunted by Buched's wife and in some versions by Medeva herself. As they progress, they leave various marks on the land, furrows, trenches and burial mounds, which are named and located by the Dinshenkas texts involved. Many of the tale's more inexplicable motivations seem to bear on questions of fosterage and group identity. Fostering in traditional insular societies was a mechanism used to bind neighbouring kin or occupational groups into wider tribal networks. The preferential treatment of particular fosterlings, and by extension their kindreds, thus represents a highly political matter that could easily become a source of intercommunal tension. Killich exhibits similar concerns with kinship, fosterage, and contending cultural systems, and one might even wonder whether all of these stories go back to a specific complex of narrative historic law that served as an oblique commentary or explication on the relationships between Ogham-using Astudiaethau and the groups that would subsequently emerge as the elites of early medieval Ireland, the Neil and the Ioganachta. A further suggestion of common origins is hinted at by the similarity of some of the names in both traditions. It's been noted by Bromwich and Evans, among others, that Freuchen, the name of one of the pigs in the Drevriu legend, finds a partial cognate in Griegen, the name of the Turk's eldest offspring. Similarly, Banvan of the pigs of Drevriu can be compared with the Welsh forms Banu and Benwig, found in the hunting of the Turk, all three names apparently deriving from Banwo, a substrate term for pigling. The late medieval Fenian epic, sometimes known as the Chase of the Seedman Ban, presents another example of a pig hunting epic of this kind. The hunt begins, significantly enough, in the plain of Femen, a liminal zone associated with supernatural encounters, origin legends, and initiations. It was here that the swineherds had their vision of the founding of Cashel in the legend previously described. We might observe the character of the hunted boar of Forval that appears in this tale, the horrific appearance of which is described thus. There's an interesting resemblance here to the Hich, the Gutta, the tailless black sow of Welsh folk custom that was believed to chase children on Calan Gaeaf, the evening before the 1st of November, sometimes in association with a headless white lady. Another late Fenian romance in which pigs of this kind appear is Torgech Damada agus Grania. As its title suggests, this narrative is chiefly concerned with the flight of the lovers Dermot and Grania before the cohorts of the jealous Finn McCool. The boar hunting sequence towards the end of the story is an echo of this pursuit, and the boar in question turns out to be Dermot's own foster brother, transformed into a singed pig without ear or tail after being attacked by Dermot's birth father in a fit of jealous rage. Dermot and the pig, as had been prophesied by the foster brother's own father, end up dying on the same day. Plotting the itineraries described in these anthropomorphic Irish hunting epics, we find a suggestion, if no more than that, of a relationship to the incidence of Ogham inscriptions in Ireland. The correspondence is rather less precise in the case of the Chase of the Seedman Ban, which only skirts the northern edge of the most dense Ogham area in the southwest before terminating in the key location of Magnai. A rather more striking correspondence is apparent with the older pigs of Drevriu itinerary, which adheres rather more closely to the belt of Ogham inscriptions extending across the northern central plain. This area, part of the hegemonic sphere of the southern Inail in the early Middle Ages, was also the home of a number of smaller vassal people, or Astudiaethau. One ethnonym that crops up with some regularity along the route of the pigs of Drevriu is Delvna, enclaves of whom we find in Brega, Westmeath, Roscommon and County Sligo. Such a distribution adds some weight to the idea that a narrative of this kind could be used, as it was among the native Australians, as a form of tribal self-identification, linking geographically scattered but culturally affiliated groups of this kind. Finally, some mention should be made of the folklore surrounding the Black Pig Dyke, a series of prehistoric ditch and palisade structures around the Northern Irish border. A number of different agencies have been associated with the production of these earthworks, including Danes and a giant Avank-like monster known as a Pisht. However, the most widespread etiology of the Black Pig Dyke is a story known as the transformed schoolmaster. A number of variants of this legend, which involves a wicked schoolmaster transformed into a pig and hunted by his former pupils, were collected by the Irish Folklore Commission over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the course of his flight, the transformed schoolmaster is held responsible for the formation of a number of landscape features, including, but not limited to, the Black Pig Dyke earthwork complex. Most of the examples of this tale type were collected in the general area of the dykes themselves. More specifically, there were notable clusters around the Boyne Valley, Westmeath, and Magnai areas, distinctly recalling the geography of the Pigs of Drevrieux. The fact that two distinct narrative cycles with such a similar constellation of motifs have been discovered in these specific areas almost 7 centuries apart offers an impressive proof of the Swedish folklorist Carl von Sydow's concept of the ecotype. These pig hunting epics are characterized by a strong topographic interest, a motif of human to animal shapeshifting, and an etiological aspect that's reminiscent of the transformer legends previously discussed. A number of similar tales containing some or all of these motifs also appear in the literature of medieval Wales. As in Ireland, the dominant modal tone of these medieval pig hunting itineraries is typically that of the pastoral romance or even the burlesque. Distinct overtones of the latter are certainly apparent in the Killoch version of the hunting of the Turk. Another good example of one of these rather overblown literary pig chases can be found in the account of Henwen, which is included in the commentary that accompanies Triad 26. Here, the giant white sow leaves a trail of creative destruction across the landscape of Wales, establishing permanent alterations to the local ecology and agricultural practices. The broad resemblance, in its South Walian section at least, to the geography of the hunting of the Turk has led some scholars to wonder if the Henwen legend may be an imitation or pastiche of the former. Be this as it may, there's a broad body of evidence that this generic tale type may have been more widely established in the medieval Welsh narrative culture. The pig rustling episode that occurs towards the beginning of the 4th branch exhibits many of the key features of the form. We might note the precisely delineated route by which the pigs, having been taken from Pryderi in exchange for some illusory treasures, are conveyed to the north via Mochdref in Ceredigion and Mochnant in Powys, among other named places. On one level, this looks like a straightforward toponymic origin legend, explaining the incidence of ostensibly pig-themed place names across the landscape of Wales. However, it would be hard to account for it exclusively in these terms. Mochnant and Mochdref are too common in Wales to dictate a particular route of this kind. W.J. Griffith may not have been exaggerating too much when he said that every parish would have contained a place name of this kind. What we have here looks more like a specific set of directions from southwest to northwest Wales via Powys and the hinterlands of the English border. Once again, we're led to suspect that some kind of navigational purpose may have motivated the perpetuation of these narratives in their oral form. This navigational purpose is suggested by a number of other topographic itineraries of the Welsh tradition, as we've already observed. Such then is the evidence for the ethnozoological complex that I would describe as the topographic pig. We've seen how the wandering pig motif appears throughout the insular world, from Brittany to Scotland and on both sides of the Irish Sea. Likewise, the topographic pig hunt is replicated in a surprisingly consistent form in both Ireland and Wales from the early Middle Ages to the early modern period. Given the range and depth of this expression, it seems unlikely to me that we can explain away these forms in terms of medieval scholarly invention, as the current fashion for anti-nativist interpretation would tend to encourage. The idea that the inhabitants of Ireland and Wales would have been incapable of topographic discourse prior to their discovery of Isidore's Etymologica is, of course, palpable nonsense, as we can see from the numerous ethnographic comparanda. Likewise, the obvious resemblance of the insular topographic pig hunts to the archaic and widespread transformer legend format tends to indicate a prehistoric origin. None of this is to say that the medieval redactors did not play an active and creative role in the shaping of this material, but the idea that it was created ex nihilo during the early Christian period should be roundly dismissed, for this body of material at least. While we can and should acknowledge this prehistoric background, the precise origins of this native material will probably remain a matter of speculation. My own suspicion is that the topographic pig complex may have been inspired in the first instance by the impression made by the megalithic landscape on the incoming Proto-Celtic settlers in the insular world, whose arrival has been located at various times between the 3rd and the 1st millennia BC. These associations were perhaps further qualified by interactions with the pre-Celtic indigenous populations, who, like the subjugated English after the Norman invasion, may have been relegated to swine herding and other low status roles within the agricultural economy. The curious prevalence of substrate terms in the porcine vocabulary of the insular Celtic languages, first identified by the late Eric Hamp, tends to point in this direction, as do the various medieval traditions associating pigs with the supernatural underworlds of Anuvan or the She. While we can speak with more certainty about the specific instance of the hunting of the Turk itself, the development of which can be situated with some confidence, well, I'll start this one again. While we can speak with more certainty about the specific, instance of the hunting of the Turk itself, the development of which can be situated with some confidence in the post-Roman period and the early Middle Ages. Throughout this paper, we've hinted at a particular association between this body of tradition and the so-called vassal people, or Astudiaethau, associated with the practice of Ogham inscription. Similarly, in Wales, there appears to have been a particular link with the Cambro-Gaelic communities, who were also associated with the use of Ogham. As we can see from this map, there's a clear relationship between these Ogham inscriptions and the route of the hunting of the Turk. From this, it seems to me, we might impute that the tradition was initially developed and circulated among these Cambro-Gaelic communities in the post-Roman period, while they still perhaps retained a distinct ethnic identity. The hunting of the Turk would appear to have grown up out of a topographic pig hunting legend of the type that we've been discussing, probably centered on the Cwm Turk area of the southwest Brecon foothills. This appears to have combined with a narrative historical account of the defense of the Preseli region by the Cambro-Gaelic federates against a raiding party from Ireland. This hybrid tale would not only have bolstered the collective identity of the Cambro-Gaelic communities, it would have also served as a practical narrative route map connecting their various enclaves. Overlaying this picture with the geography of the cult of St. David, we can see that the latter spread out from West Wales along much the same lines. In pre-Viking South Wales, the dominant cult of the British-speaking majority would have been that of Celtaidd, whose church retained a powerful hold in the fertile lowlands around Astudiaethau and the Vale of Glamorgan. We can see how the route of the hunting of the Turk skirts around these areas, extending beyond the nominal bishoprics of St. David, only in the areas where extra diocesan dedications to the saint are also in evidence. Nonetheless, just as the cult of St. David's became increasingly generalised to the whole of South Wales, one might suspect that the hunting of the Turk became a popular story among the wider native populations of this region. Indeed, we can even see a parallel between the expansive and predatory nature of the Arthurian complex more generally, and the tendency of the Davidian cult to absorb legends and dedications of lesser known saints and reassign them to their hero. The two complexes may well have spread along similar vectors. If this analysis can be accepted, it affords some interesting cultural, historic, and social historic insights from the evolution of tradition in its proto-literary stages to the dynamics of group identity and intercommunal relations in early medieval Wales. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Will, for a very wide-ranging, interesting talk there. Are you happy to take questions? I should have asked you this before, really.
Yes, very much so, yeah.
Okay, well, if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask Will, probably the best thing would be for you to, you know, either write something in the chat or put your hand up electronically, and then I can, I'll be the referee and sort of invite you to say your question or whatever. I mean, while people think about things to say, perhaps I'll ask you something, if that's all right, Will.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's what I want to do really is ask you sort of methodological question, I suppose. I mean, you've given us an impressive array of evidence there, you know, which sort of is spread over different countries and different sort of periods and different types of evidence. And you've sort of alluded, of course, to issues of, you know, independent generation of similar motifs and that sort of thing, and also to issues of you know, sort of prehistoric inheritance and issues of sort of borrowing. I mean, you know, all of this is very probabilistic, isn't it? But how do you go about choosing, you know, which of the similarities and so on you deem to be sort of significant and which ones aren't? I mean, is there a sort of you know, any kind of scientific way of doing this in your opinion?
I'm not sure that there is, to be honest, Simon. I mean, I literally, you know, it did involve trawling through a vast body of evidence and really just sort of inductively looking out for patterns, you know, as and when they arose. And, you know, the sort of resemblance between the transformer legends, which actually occur across a vast range of different contexts. So I only just picked two of the more sort of extreme and remote ones there, you know, struck me as interesting, and really that led me to feel as there was a sort of, you know, a broadly human thing going on here. You know, I think it's sometimes a mistake to see, well, it's always a mistake to see cultures in isolation, though obviously each culture does have its own quiddities and idiosyncrasies, but it is when one sees a pattern like that, to my mind, I mean, you know, other people can form their own judgments, but to my mind, those are quite sort of impressive correspondences, and I felt that there was something going on. I'm not sure I completely know I could completely explain it, whether it's you know, polygenesis or you know, some sort of deep time inheritance, or a mixture of the two. Yeah, it really did just literally involve trawling through large bodies of evidence and identifying patterns where I felt they existed. I mean, I think it is we are in the field of the arts and the humanities, and that involves sometimes making quite intuitive judgments, which really the readers and the peer reviewers will have to decide whether they stack up or not. But in terms of my general methodology, I mean, I do look first for sort of wider geographical patterns of communication between certain regions, and where I find those, they're always my starting point. So here, the incidence of Ogham inscriptions, between certain areas of Ireland and southwest Wales, and also certain hagiographic links as well, hagiocratic links, sort of calls me to look in those directions for the possibility of communication through those networks.
Thanks, Will. Cwydyn and then Marged, perhaps in that order.
Hello. Just a couple of quick comments on the pigs, the romping pigs through the landscape.
Yes.
Just want to add to your collection, if you don't have it already. And years ago, was in a Irish Gaelic course in the Celtaidd Lar, Glenfin in Donegal, and with storytellers coming in telling us local folklore. And one of the main things was the Blue Stack Mountains in the south of the area, South Donegal, and there was stories about a boar romping through there and where it stopped and all the different place names on its journey. The other comment was about not necessarily pigs, but itineraries in general. I was in a conversation about why are itineraries so common in folklore and old stories. And one thing that occurred to me is it's because you can remember them, because the geographic sequence provides a link between them all. And I thought there's 1 month in my life when I can tell you what happened every single 30 days of the month. And it was because I was walking around the Highlands on my own in the winter, November, December, and sleeping in sheds or bothies or whatever I could find. I could tell you what I did the one day, the next day, the next day, the next day, because there's a common link to help you remember. So
yes, I mean, I think that's an extremely valid point. It's interesting that it sort of works in a variety of directions. On one hand, the journey, the narrative sequence sort of may serve as a guide to the journey, as a set of directions, as it were. But it can also be used because the human memory, the human sort of cognitive mapping is such a sort of hardwired part of our psychology that, as the classical ancients, established, it could be used as a way of actually remembering all sorts of different things. So, it became a kind of technique of memory that flowered particularly in the Renaissance, where people like Francis Yates have written about this, where vast bodies of rhetoric, for instance, could be memorized by visualizing along the landscape. I mean, to take your journey, you could remember each of those days. You could place certain sort of visual cues within the context of that journey, and that would help you remember those things extremely effectively. So it does seem to have served a number of useful purposes, and I think that accounts for its survival. I mean, I think this is getting into something I think is quite interesting for looking at cultural history. Meme theory. You look at the fitness of a cultural unit like that, a cultural mechanism, and if it's useful, it survives and it gets perpetuated, just as a gene does in the natural world.
Thanks.
Sorry, carry on.
No, diolch yn fawr.
Well, we've reached 8 o'clock, but if you're Margaret has her hand up, so are you happy to take one more question?
Very much so. Yes, very much so.
I'm afraid it's not my hand; it's the hand of a friend of mine, Patrick.
Ah, yes.
Yeah,
My old teacher.
Hello, thank you very much, Will. Enjoyed that a lot. Very interesting. I just
Good.
wanted to add to put North Wales on the map. The Welsh Folk Museum collected quite a lot of material from the North Wales, and Jerry Hunter published an article about this in the Proceedings of Harvard Celtic Colloquium ages ago, back in 1991. It's called Dead Pigs, and then it's got a long subtitle, but it's about people, I think near Llanrwst, killing a pig or trying to, and then it runs around and then it explains the names of places. So there's a Cae Perfedd, and instead of that being a middle field, it's where the entrails fall out and so on. It's very like the Irish material. So I think he gives references to more stuff, but I can't really remember now. But clearly this was current in the 20th century as a type of tale that people were still telling to explain place names in North Wales.
That's very interesting, Patrick. And I really owe you a debt of thanks, actually, because this whole piece of work was very much inspired by things you told me at Cambridge. I think it was you that first put me on to the idea of the pig as a symbol of the underworld and so forth. So yeah, I'm very grateful to you, and I've also found your writing about Irish and Welsh interactions very stimulating, and it's been a great influence in a lot of the work that's been done here.
Well, thank you very much. Very nice. Anyway, thank you again.
Okay, well, we've gone past 8 o'clock, and so perhaps you better call it tonight. But thanks very much indeed, Will, for bringing this seminar series to a close in such an interesting way. Well, yes, that's it. We haven't got anything else lined up this academic year, but we will be back in the autumn with a new series, and I'm sure that I'll bother you all with the details of that when they're forthcoming. So thank you all for turning out, and we hope to see you all again in the next academic year.
No star.